There's a name that still captivates the world more than 3,000 years after his death. A name synonymous with golden treasures, divine kingship, and one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. Tutankhamun, the boy Pharaoh, the living god, the young ruler whose intact tomb revealed the unimaginable wealth and power of ancient Egypt. But here's the thing about Tutankhamun that most people never fully understood. The story the world thought it knew about his short life and sudden death was not the full story, not even close. Because underneath the golden mask, underneath the royal regalia, underneath the myths of divine perfection and peaceful reign, there was a fragile human body whose genetic code carried a tragic secret. And that secret was finally exposed through modern DNA analysis, revealing truths the sands of time had long hidden. For years, the public conversation around Tutankhamun centered on the surface. The gold, yes. The treasures, absolutely. But also the endless, tantalizing questions. Why did this powerful young king die so young, at only 19 years old? Was it murder by a jealous advisor, a fatal chariot accident during a hunt, the infamous curse of the pharaohs, or something even more mysterious? Was there something hidden beneath the surface of the most famous pharaoh on earth? Something his own body and bloodline were trying to communicate through the artifacts left in his tomb. The many walking canes showing signs of wear, the medicinal herbs, the orthopedic supports, the depictions of him seated while hunting. And while historians, archaeologists, and the public drew dramatic conclusions, and nobody truly listened to the biological evidence waiting silently in his bones, the answer was always there. It was in his DNA. It was in his immune system. It was in the genetic consequences of centuries of deliberate royal inbreeding. And the truth, when you actually sit down and look at it honestly through the lens of modern science without the noise of ancient myths, Hollywood movies, or conspiracy theories, is far more human, far more tragic, and far more scientifically coherent than any of the stories the world preferred to believe. To understand the hidden DNA secret behind Tutankhamun's mysterious death, you first have to understand something about the dangers of royal inbreeding and its devastating impact on human genetics. Most people think of royal bloodlines as pure and divine, a sacred lineage carefully preserved to maintain power and closeness to the gods. And for the pharaohs of ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, brother-sister marriages and close family unions were not just accepted, they were a religious and political necessity to keep the bloodline pure and ensure divine authority remained within one family. But in genetics, this practice carries catastrophic risks. When close relatives reproduce, harmful recessive gene variants that would normally be masked by a diverse gene pool become expressed at much higher rates. The result is an accumulation of genetic disorders, weakened immunity, congenital malformations, and physical vulnerabilities that can turn a seemingly powerful dynasty into one plagued by frailty and early death. Tutankhamun experienced this, not mildly, not quietly, but severely, from the moment of his conception, while the world later celebrated him as a divine ruler who brought stability back to Egypt. The specific genetic burdens he carried were the direct consequence of his parents being full siblings, a fact confirmed by groundbreaking DNA analysis conducted on the royal mummies in 2010 by a team led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass. His father, almost certainly the mummy from KV-55, widely believed to be the heretic Pharaoh Akhenaten, and his mother, the younger lady mummy from KV-35, shared an extraordinarily high degree of genetic similarity, consistent with a full brother and sister relationship. This incestuous union loaded Tutankhamun's genome with multiple harmful recessive variants that manifested in painful and debilitating conditions throughout his short life. Genetic research combined with advanced CT scans revealed several serious pathologies. He suffered from Köhler disease 2, a rare condition causing a vascular necrosis of the bone in the foot, where poor blood supply leads to the death of bone tissue, resulting in collapse, deformity, and chronic pain. He also had a clubfoot on his left foot, oligodactyly, a missing bone in one toe, scoliosis of the spine, a cleft palate, and other skeletal abnormalities. These were not isolated issues. They were the visible and painful expression of generations of systematic inbreeding that had progressively weakened the royal family's genetic health. None of these conditions alone would necessarily have been fatal for a young man in his late teens, but they left Tutankhamun frail, in constant discomfort, and heavily dependent on walking canes, more than 130 of which were discovered in his tomb, many showing clear signs of actual long-term use. Now, layer onto this already severely compromised genetic foundation a deadly infectious disease that proved to be the final blow. Advanced DNA testing on his mummy and several other royal relatives detected strong traces of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite responsible for the most severe and often fatal form of malaria. Malaria was endemic along the Nile River due to the abundant mosquito breeding grounds created by annual flooding and irrigation systems. For a genetically healthy and robust individual, a malaria infection could sometimes be survived with supportive care. But for a young man already weakened by multiple congenital disorders, chronic pain, possible immune deficiencies caused by inbreeding and limited mobility, a severe bout of malaria would have been catastrophic. It would have triggered high fever, severe anemia, organ stress, immune system collapse, and complications that made recovery from any concurrent injury nearly impossible. Scientists now conclude with high confidence that the most likely cause of Tutankhamun's death was the deadly combination of a vascular bone necrosis in his foot, Köhler disease, possibly compounded by a leg fracture from a fall due to his weakened condition, and a severe malarial infection that overwhelmed his already fragile body. This is not speculation, not Hollywood drama, and not curse mythology. This is the forensic, radiological, and genetic record revealed through state-of-the-art DNA extraction techniques, CT scanning, and peer-reviewed analysis of the royal mummies. The question of royal purity and inbreeding deserves a direct answer because it has shaped our understanding of Egyptian dynasties for centuries. The pharaohs genuinely believed that marrying within the family would preserve their divine status, keep political power concentrated, and maintain the cosmic order. In biological reality, it did the opposite. It concentrated harmful genetic mutations across generations. Tutankhamun's family tree shows a clear pattern of accumulated malformations, cleft palates, bone disorders, weakened immunity, and high infant mortality running through multiple generations. His own marriage to his half-sister Enkisenamen continued this tragic pattern, resulting in 2 stillborn daughters whose mummies showed signs of severe genetic defects, including spinal deformities. Beyond the immediate medical genetics, Tutankhamun's DNA carries a much deeper ancestral and historical story. The history of one of the most powerful yet genetically fragile royal bloodlines in human civilization. The 18th dynasty was a period of immense wealth, military conquest, religious revolution under his father Akhenaten, and eventual restoration of traditional polytheism. But genetically, it was a lineage under siege from its own cultural and religious practices. The DNA evidence not only confirmed parentage relationships with high statistical probability, but also painted a vivid picture of a boy king who ruled in unimaginable splendor while suffering daily in a body that betrayed him. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 BCE during the turbulent Amarna period. He ascended the throne at approximately 8 or 9 years old after the death of his father and the short reign of his predecessor. His 9-year reign saw the restoration of the old gods, the return of the capital from Akhetaten back to Thebes, and the repair of temples damaged during his father's radical monotheistic experiment. But behind the golden throne, the divine titles, and the public image of a god-king was a frail teenager whose body was failing him. The dozens of canes, the orthopedic footwear, the medicinal plants, and artistic depictions of him seated while performing activities that other pharaohs were shown doing, standing all speak volumes about the daily reality of his genetic battle. That same genetic fragility, that same vulnerability written into every cell of his body, also reflected the immense pressures of divine kingship in ancient Egypt. A pharaoh was expected to be the living embodiment of Horus, strong, fertile, eternal, capable of leading armies and producing heirs. Instead, Tutankhamun's DNA carried the cumulative cost of generations of deliberate inbreeding. His immune system, compromised by harmful genetic variants, could not mount an effective defense against the malaria parasite that invaded his bloodstream. The bone necrosis in his foot caused chronic, debilitating pain and severely limited his mobility. A possible minor injury or fall that would have been inconsequential in a healthier individual likely became life-threatening in his weakened state. The complexity of Tutankhamun's short life is reflected in the complexity of his genetic inheritance. His DNA was a mirror of his dynasty's choices, the pursuit of divine purity that ultimately led to frailty and early death. The world saw the golden mask, the treasures, and the legends. Modern science now sees the human boy behind the pharaoh, a ruler who tried to fulfill his divine role while battling conditions that no amount of wealth or prayer could fully overcome. It took the development of modern technology, sophisticated DNA extraction from ancient mummified tissue, high-resolution CT scanning, and advanced genetic sequencing to finally give the truth the authority to speak clearly after more than 3,300 years. The landmark 2010 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, along with subsequent research, confirmed the incestuous parentage, the multiple congenital disorders, the presence of malaria parasites, and the most probable combined cause of death. This is not fan theory or sensational documentary speculation. This is the official scientific and forensic record. Tutankhamun's story, when told through the lens of his DNA rather than the lens of ancient myth, colonial-era curse stories, or modern conspiracy documentaries, is ultimately a profound story about what happens when power, tradition, and religious belief override biological reality. It is a story about the hidden human cost of maintaining pure royal bloodlines across generations. It is a story about a young king whose genetic inheritance gave him the most powerful throne in the known world, but took away his health, his mobility, and ultimately his life far too soon. His DNA was not hiding a murder plot, a curse, or divine punishment. It was carrying the very human consequences of royal choices made over centuries, a story of a dynasty that rose to unmatched heights of wealth and influence and paid the price in the fragile bodies of its final generations. A story of a boy who was worshipped as a god, but lived and died as a human being with real physical suffering. A story of how the same practices intended to preserve greatness ultimately contributed to vulnerability and early death. And the treasures remain. The golden death mask remains. The chariot, the throne, the jewelry, and the countless artifacts remain. They do not exist despite what his body endured, but alongside the biological reality of his life. Because the same royal blood that weakened his body also placed him in the most opulent burial the world had ever seen. You cannot separate the legend from the biology. You cannot have the immortal Pharaoh without the mortal boy who carried the genetic burden of his dynasty. The world spent decades and even centuries asking the wrong questions about Tutankhamun's death. It asked about curses, conspiracies, and dramatic assassinations, when it should have asked what his genes and his family practices were revealing. His DNA was not hiding anything shameful or supernatural. The truth was buried with him in the Valley of the Kings. Now, with the full genetic record in hand, with the DNA evidence, with the CT scans, the forensic analysis, and peer-reviewed studies, there is no excuse left for the old myths and romanticized stories. There is only the truth. And the truth is this: Tutankhamun was a human being whose extraordinary position and extraordinary suffering came from the same extraordinary source, his royal DNA and the cultural practices of his time. He deserved, at minimum, to be understood as more than just a golden icon. In an era where we better understand genetics, inbreeding depression, and the long-term consequences of consanguineous marriages, we have the obligation to correct the historical record. The old narratives were wrong, not just incomplete or romantic, but factually and scientifically incorrect. Tutankhamun's DNA is a map of ancient Egyptian royal history as much as it is a biological profile. The hidden DNA secret behind his mysterious death was the tragic intersection of immense power, religious tradition, and genetic reality. Scientists have finally exposed it. It's time the world finally accepted the full, profoundly human story of the boy king who ruled Egypt but lost his battle with his own DNA.